right. Good evening or good morning or good afternoon, whatever it is for you. I'm Chuck, and Brock is with me as well. And this is Generous Theology. And today, it being Thursday for us, we are spending some time in the Oxford Handbook of Reformed Theology. And after spending some time, we're kind of working through this book, perhaps a little bit out of the order in which it was laid out, but that's okay. We spent some time, first of all, working with some of the texts in part two, and then we spent some time with some of the topics and themes in part three. And today is our first section that we're doing in part one, which is entitled Contexts. And some of that is historical context, some of that is geographical context. But today, we are in chapter 5, entitled Reformed Theology and the Enlightenment by David S. Seitzma. I was not particularly familiar with David Seitzma, but Brock, you informed me that he is quite well known and highly respected. And when I looked him up, I saw that he's with the Junius Institute, which I have heard of them. In fact, I get some of their material online. And so, yeah, very interesting. He's the is an associate professor at Tokyo Christian University. He's a research curator of the Junius Institute for Digital Reformation Research. So, interesting to be doing study on the Enlightenment from Japan. So that's just, not that you can't do it there. Obviously can, and he does it quite well. It's just interesting, given that Japan certainly has been affected by the Enlightenment, but wasn't a key part of what was going on at that time. And certainly has had impact by other philosophies as well. So really interesting. The other thing that, I was thinking about before reading this chapter is I wondered a little bit what was going to be the context of this particular chapter. There are, I know, in some parts of the Christian world and the Reformed world specifically, there is a real there are in some parts of it there's sort of almost become an attack on the Enlightenment and Enlightenment ideas. Some of which are things that we might agree with. But there's also been a little bit of a pushback from some saying, hey, if we're going to fight against the Enlightenment, but what does that mean? What are we going to go back to pre-Enlightenment ways of thinking on things, on everything? So are we going to lose democracy, at least as we see it, as we know it in the modern era? And I've been hearing a little bit of that sort of back and forth. I just wondered where Seitzma might fall in that, or whether he would even reference that at all. And it's interesting. What he does is he introduces this essay with a brief discussion of the idea that there's maybe more than one way to look at the Enlightenment. That perhaps scholars today speak of multiple enlightenments, or at least a spectrum of perspectives, including moderate and religious enlightenments, which, while advancing new religious and philosophical ideas, were also severely critical of the radical enlightenment represented by Spinoza, by deism, and by the philosophes. So, and I think that initial that the way he begins this section carries through throughout the chapter. In essence, Seitzma keeps that thesis that there were certainly the more radical Enlightenment thinkers, but then there were those who, while they opposed the most radical of the Enlightenment thinkers, kind of took a more moderate Enlightenment type of view. And then, of course, there were also those who were opposed to much of Enlightenment philosophy. And so there are a couple other things I wanted to get into, as we talk about this chapter, Brock. But I think as we start, you have a little more background in philosophy than I do. I'm basically just limited to a single class that I took in college, and then what I've read since that time. And my class in college was really more focused on Christian philosophy and primarily on the philosophy of Herman Dooyeweerd. And then I helped when my wife, when she was still my girlfriend, when she took philosophy, she took it from a different professor, and there was a little more history of philosophy. And I remember sort of working through some of that with her when she was studying that. But I don't have as deep a knowledge as I'd like on some of these things. So I wondered, Brock, when you approached this chapter, what were you expecting perhaps to see? And was that sort of beginning the sort of the discussion of a more moderate enlightenment, something that you expected to read, or was this a new concept as well for you? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, yeah, thank you, my friend. This was I have to talk about Professor Seitzma and his inclusion with this work. I've been very critical of this work, Chuck, as you know. I've been very critical of the authors in general. I've been very critical of what I perceive is an overall approach to a sort of post-Barthian Reformed theology that seeks to recast Reformed theology in this away from the classic creeds and confessions of Luther and Calvin and the Westminster Divines and the 1689 Particular Baptists into this post-Barthians doing the dialectic waddle between Schleiermacher and Barth. And I've been very critical of that. I've been very disappointed that that's been such a thrust and theme of much of this work. And Professor Seitzma has almost single-handedly provided a counterbalance to that. Seitzma's chapter here really raises the quality of content in this Oxford Handbook for me. Very, very good reputation, very legitimate inquiry. This is one of the chapters where I felt I actually was reading an Oxford Handbook about Reformed theology. And I can't say that for many of the different chapters here. I'm not decredentializing other authors in other chapters. I would say that they're much more Reformed adjacent. That is to say, external to the Reformed tradition, critics looking in and seeking to sort of recast and reframe Reformed theology in this new modern light. And I think if you got most of these chapter authors together and we had a curated wine and cheese seminar, Chuck, maybe at the university for the weekend, and if we got together and talked, I think most of them would say that's what they're trying to do. Most of them dislike Luther and Calvin and sort of the pre-1689 confessional heritage of Reformed theology. I think most of them would admit that. But I think Seitzma represents a throwback. Seitzma represents very close to where I think these actual pre-1689 Reformed thinkers would be if they were here today. Chuck, you and I have asked each other several times, if Herman Bavinck were alive today, what would he think about, and then we throw out an idea that has sort of developed in the aftermath, since his death 100 years ago. And I think Seitzma fits very squarely in with integrity when he speaks about Reformed theology in a way that most of the other chapter authors don't seem to. And like I said, to be honest, I don't think they claim to. I think they claim to be adjacent and seeking to redefine Reformed theology. But Seitzma, I think, is the real deal here. And that's a blessing. Now, one of the things that excited me about this chapter was not just Seitzma, but it was this opportunity to talk about the Enlightenment and Reformed theology's role within it. There's some controversy here, Chuck. For many, Reformed theology, or Calvinism, as it's sometimes more pejoratively called, is seen to be a philosophy or a system of thought that came of age during the classical period of the modern Enlightenment. And yet it did so while still retaining so much of the best of what came before it. One of the master keys to understanding much in Enlightenment history is to understand what it is pushing back against, or what most Enlightenment thinkers dislike or hate, for lack of a better word. And I think if you look at the key figures of the Enlightenment, you will find that they are not all, but almost all, strident secularists who wanted to recast as much of the human condition and experience in these modern secularistic ways, instead of using the traditional religious categories. So you think of, for example, when you consider the Enlightenment, almost everybody will, for good reason, put forward the philosophes. And these are the thinkers who are not all of the Enlightenment, but they're so defining for the Enlightenment. Who would that be? This would be people like Voltaire, people like Rousseau, people like Montesquieu, Denis Diderot, David Hume, René Descartes, Adam Smith, and others. And most of them will talk about framing human understanding and framing the essence or the ontology of the world in humanistic or secularist ways. For example, Denis Diderot, famous. Diderot's famous project was the creation of the modern encyclopedia. Now, if you're like me, you love encyclopedias. I mean, those things were just the bee's knees. Growing up, my family was poor. We didn't have encyclopedias. And we had to go to the high status family. They had encyclopedias. And by God's own grace and help, they would get sick of them. They would get bored with them. And so they'd let little old me, little low status, unimportant, not wealthy, certainly not wealthy enough to afford a volume of an encyclopedia. They would let little old me borrow one of those volumes. And Chuck, I'd read, and I'd read, and I'd read, and I'd read for hours in the encyclopedia. I would have thought nothing wrong associated with the encyclopedic movement. But in fact, if you read Diderot's explicit reasons for creating an encyclopedia, if you read what he himself said he wanted to do, why he wanted an encyclopedia, he wanted a secular canon. He wanted a rival to the Holy Scriptures. It bothered him that the medieval thinkers around him relied on the Bible for the source of truth and wisdom and wholesomeness and righteous thought. And so the encyclopedia, as conceived by him and others, first-generation encyclopedists, had this explicit you could say anti-medievalism if you want, but they had an anti-Christian approach that underlies all of encyclopediaology. Wow. That really shocked me when I found that out, because growing up, I found so much profit in reading the encyclopedias. I found them to be so useful and such good, wholesome tools, obviously from God, that I could not conceive that their aim was to overthrow religious thinking. And yet, Chuck, that's where we are. You'll find this is the case throughout almost all of what we call Enlightenment thinking. In the French Revolution, they had a saying, no gods, no masters. And these are the classic things that mark what it means to be quote-unquote modern, what it means quote-unquote to be enlightened in the West, in modernity. Now, God in his kindness allowed Christians to participate in much of this. So much so that if the encyclopedia was founded as a secular canon, it is nevertheless still the case that many people, secularists and Christians alike, collaborated together to produce high-quality volumes of knowledge. So am I anti-encyclopedia? No, not the least bit. I praise God for the integrity that went into the encyclopedic tradition. And yet, Chuck, A, B, C, anything but Christ. If you want to understand one of the major themes of the Enlightenment, it is A, B, C, anything but Christ. Anything but the religiosity of the medieval Christianity that preceded it. And so you'll hear people in this tradition talk about reason, progress, reform, all of these things which sound good, even to me as a Christian, until you come to understand that what are they reasoning against? It's going to be the cross. It's going to be Christianity. Progress. Wow, who could be against progress? Well, what's progress? And you'll find that so many of the people who want quote unquote progress simply want a secular, anti-religious, humanistic way of thinking to dominate. And then reform. Well, what's bad about reform? Who could be against reform? Chuck, I never thought I would be against reform. And yet, what do you hear today in the culture with the proponents of these Enlightenment philosophies? You hear that they want to capture and own things like science, things like democracy, things that have no place in Christian life, or at least so much of the Enlightenment thought gives us that positioning. And so that's why this chapter is so interesting and important because the Enlightenment is almost entirely secular and anti-religious. And yet, as that ice cube of secularism was dropped into the hot pot of medieval knowledge and reasoning, something happened, Chuck. The secularists helped make Christianity better. I'm blessed by the lives of many of the Enlightenment secularists and humanists. I think they've been a net blessing. And also, their products, things like the modern university system, the Wissenschaften that you and I have talked about, although I am against it in its narrower forms, Christians have participated in making modern universities better things, good things in the culture. The same thing with the encyclopedia. The same thing with, for example, medicine. Medicine at one time was largely controlled by religious forces. We look at the hospitals, Chuck. There used to be, of all the hospitals that were in the United States, perhaps what, 30, 40, 50% or more were founded by religious institutions and had religious patronage. Today, no one thinks that medicine is particularly held hostage by a religious mindset or a worldview. And yet there's great blessing that has come from that. That religious patronage has made a difference. And Chuck, a secular doctor can treat me just as well as a Christian doctor. And so I praise God for that blessing. But at the end of the day, if you really want to know what the Enlightenment is about, in my opinion, remember the ABCs. Anything but Christ. Now that's a strident way to sort of open this up, Chuck. And there's going to be so much more to it. There's going to be nuance. There's going to be shades of gray. And there are going to be people who think the Enlightenment is the best thing since sliced bread. So let me throw that back to you. And how did you start to engage with this chapter? And maybe even if you have a different sort of perspective on the Enlightenment and its place, how did you sort of come at this? And what were some of your expectations?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think when I was younger, the Enlightenment was often presented. The term we learned in our history class in junior high school at Sioux Center Christian School was we termed it the Renaissance, and our teacher sort of had the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, even though they're not the same thing. He kind of had them go together as if one sort of led to the other. And the Renaissance, of course, was the rebirth, and the Enlightenment, more light being shed on the matter as sort of the way it was described. And so, at least through my junior high school years, and I don't think that really ever changed in high school. We learned of this era as being generally a positive thing, right? Then, as we studied history, we were taught that much of Enlightenment thinking had an impact on the way our Constitution was shaped and the early history of the country and the Declaration of Independence. And so there were a lot of connections made between the history of the United States and the Enlightenment as well. Now, what I'll say is then there was always a little bit of a counterpoint to that, not necessarily super strong, I do remember though hearing a little bit of that counterpoint coming from my father, who was not a historian, was not, that was not a philosopher, although he had some interest in that kind of thing. He was an engineer, scientist, and a lot of his interest in philosophy specifically was around the history of the philosophy of science and how that related to Christianity. And because of that particular interest, he already had sort of implanted me with this idea that wait, we do have to be a little bit careful that we don't sort of suddenly um, replace Christianity with Enlightenment ideas, or we have to be careful that we don't sort of say that they're the same thing, and that there may be some negative things that came from that. It was from him that I first learned about deism and how many of the founding fathers of our country were deists and didn't necessarily believe that God was actively engaged in upholding the world as with his hands, and instead they believed that God sort of kind of set things off, and then kind of went away and just let things go, and so that was the sort of the first I heard of some concerns in that regard, and then through college as well, some critiques that came down. I think I mentioned that my philosophy class was primarily a Dewey-Werdian philosophy class, but as a result of that, though, we learned a little bit about sort of the anti-revolutionary movement in the Netherlands in the 19th century, which was sort of a little bit of a backlash, maybe not specifically to the Enlightenment in general, but to some very key ideas of the Enlightenment as they were expressed, especially in France, in revolutionary France, and that's where the name, the Anti-Revolutionary Party, which was sort of the Christian Democratic Party of that era, that actually Abraham Kuyper was a part of. He was the Prime Minister of the Netherlands under that banner. And so there we learned a little bit that okay, yeah, there was some pushback on some of these things because at least I think the way I understood it was, hey, if you take Enlightenment ideas to their fullest extent, this is what you come up with. You come up with the excesses of the French Revolution, the excesses of sort of modern ways of thinking, and those were some of the things that people like Abraham Kuyper and Herman Bavinck were opposed to. And Herman Bavinck wasn't real well known yet at that point, but his name came up in college because there were those in at least in my circles who had read him in Dutch. But Abraham Kuyper especially was the name that came up. Then over the years, as I sort of, I never really have dived real deeply into philosophy. I've done a little bit more reading and sort of Dewey-Werdian type philosophy, some of the ideas of Kuyper and some of those in philosophy. And it became clear that there were some very specific ideas of the Enlightenment that I recognized as being some of those things that for years I'd been hearing problems with, that perhaps as Christians we would have some issue. And one of those is this idea of the mind-body dualism, the belief that the mind and the body are fundamentally distinct and separate. And this was something that not that my father, but also others of my professors in college and others that I talked to about these issues over the years were very much concerned about. And this was an idea that they were opposed to, and so instead, said, hey, as Christians, we believe in a greater unity, that part of who we are as human beings is mind and body both, and that they go together. That we're embodied for a reason. We're not just simply brains on a stick, but we are embodied. And actually, in recent years, some of that has come out even more. And talking not just to philosophers now, but to pastors and theologians about, well, what does that mean for us? How then shall we live if we're going to be opposed to that dualism? And more recognizing that this dualism was a feature of much of Enlightenment thought. Now, Seitzma will likely say that's more the radical side of the Enlightenment, perhaps, but it also had an impact even in the more moderate Enlightenment, and also ended up having an impact on the way Christians think. And so that was, all those things sort of have been going through my mind. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, more recently, there has been sort of in certain, it's maybe still somewhat of a fringe movement, but there seems to be almost a view that we need to get rid of the Enlightenment, that everything about the Enlightenment was bad, and we need to go back to pre-Enlightenment ways of thinking in all sorts of ways. I first actually came across some of those ideas when I encountered Catholic integralists in the American Solidarity Party, the political party that I was fairly involved with for a while, and still follow and still follow some of the things that they're doing. And Catholic integralists were only a part of that group. They're probably not even a majority. In fact, probably a very small minority, but with outsized voices in that party. But those Catholic integralists as well were very much opposed to Enlightenment thinking, and we see even in thinking about where was the argument against Enlightenment back in those days, and to some extent the Catholic Church perhaps might have been the strongest opposition to it. There were some in the Reformed world as well who were very much opposed. But it does seem that actually Enlightenment ideas took hold much more strongly in Protestant Europe, at least early on, than in Catholic Europe. And so all of these things, all of these ideas, all of this sort of history that I sort of just have a general sense of, has been sort of moving around in my head without me fully understanding it all, and so I was looking forward to this chapter to see, okay, how does he answer some of these things? And of course, Seitzma didn't write this chapter specifically for me, and knowing exactly what I had been thinking about, and so of course he didn't. And so in some ways there are still some questions I have about this thesis, and what does it mean to think of multiple enlightenments? But it also was sort of an interesting addition now to these other thoughts that I'd been having, and things that I'd been hearing about the Enlightenment and the challenge of the Enlightenment, and whether there's any benefit we get from it, or whether it's all just I'm not a big black and white type person. I tend to not to always say, okay, everything about this is bad, everything about this is good, and never shall the twain meet. I think there often is some gray in those things, and anticipated that there likely are some things that we can learn from Enlightenment thinkers, and I think this perhaps is Seitzma's thought as well. Is to, although he doesn't take in this essay anyway, he doesn't seem to be entirely evaluative. He tends to speak more historically and just sort of describing things. But I do get the sense that the very idea of saying, hey, the thesis is that there was a moderate Enlightenment, does sort of suggest then that there may be something to be learned from these more moderate Enlightenment thinkers as well. So yeah, it was very much interesting to me. And then there's a fairly significant history here that Seitzman draws, and this is a history where I've spent more time with sort of the political history of Europe and sort of the religious history, more from the idea of like the religious wars and Catholic versus Protestant, and and as well as secular versus Christian. But what was interesting is not really understanding, exactly how do these Enlightenment ideas, how did they affect Christian thinkers, my own Dutch Reformed tradition clearly had to have been fairly impacted by it, because the Netherlands seems to have been sort of the hotbed, especially early on. It was the Netherlands and France that were the real hotbed for this. German thinkers kind of didn't necessarily move in that direction, and in fact, I read elsewhere, not in this chapter, but I read elsewhere that some of the early Enlightenment thinkers in Germany chose to publish in Dutch instead of in German, because they were more likely to get response to their ideas by writing in Dutch, because that was sort of in Protestant Europe, and just as France was for Catholic Europe, was sort of the hotbed for some of these ideas, and that was new to me. I didn't know any of that. That was very interesting. So. Now, this, what Seisman does is really interesting. He mentions a lot of names, a lot of thinkers that you and I, Brock, have talked about over the years in some of our study of philosophy. Um, he begins here also with thinking about how do some of these Greek ideas, Aristotle and Plato, how do they play into it? And then Rene Descartes, and then are there other Enlightenment thinkers who perhaps were even not fully accepting of Cartesianism, either because it went too far, or maybe it didn't go far enough in some ways. Um, and yeah, I feel like I'm just kind of like, hey, I learned all this stuff and I just got to spit it out now, but that's kind of my reaction then once I got into reading this chapter. Now, because I don't have as much background in this, I think there were times when I was kind of like, well, I wish I could, like Brock, ask you and ask some other people about some of the very specific things that get talked about here. And is this how you see these things, and sort of get your reaction to sort of some of that history, and so I'm interested in that. I'm going to leave it kind of wide open so that you can pick threads that you'd like to sort of pick at, and then avoid threads that you don't want to touch, if and that's perfectly fine. But I'm interested in sort of your thoughts then as you read the chapter. Where did it sort of match up with things that you were aware of before? Were there some new things for you as well in this chapter?
Yeah, I would say this is such a profitable chapter. Now, the first thing I want to clear the decks with Seitzma is, if you look at the first sentence in this chapter, Seitzma seems to be actually attacking the very thing that I did in the first segment. Let me read that sentence. He opens the chapter and says this: the notion of a single enlightenment identified with the French philosophers, once so forcefully argued by Peter Gay in his book, The Enlightenment and Interpretation, is now passé. So Seitzma, in a sense, comes against comes against the thesis that I just brought a few moments ago about the Enlightenment being these French philosophers, and they're sneaking into modernity of these concepts of secularism, anything but Christ. So what do I have to say? The answer is that this chapter is beautiful in bringing out just how rich the field is. And so if Seitzma is saying something to the equivalent of Iowa is much more than corn and concrete, he's right, right? I mean, Seitzma's right. I'm not arguing with him. Iowa is so much more than corn and concrete. And yet, how far can you take the corn and concrete idea? You can take it pretty far. And I think that's my point here, contra Seitzma. Sure. If you look at the Enlightenment in all of its depth, it's not really fair to bunch it around the French philosophers. It's not really fair to bunch it around this anti-religious secularism of Voltaire, Locke, Diderot. And yet at the same point in time, it's not fair to say Iowa is simply corn and concrete. And yet there's some value in pointing that out. And that's an awareness that I appreciate. And I like Seitzma bringing here. One of the things that's so funny, so humorous, Chuck, is that within Reformed theology, so much of what today is considered traditional Reformed theology is in fact the product of the Enlightenment. Jonathan Edwards, Seitzma says, in the very first paragraph, is a new thinker. Do you hear that from Calvinists when you talk with them? Do they come to you and portray, oh, Jonathan Edwards, that new progressive thinker? Well, no. No, they tend to talk about Edwards in his commitment in a traditionalist sort of fashion. And yet there's truth. There's truth to what Seitzma says. Edwards really is, in some senses, a new and modern thinker. And it's worse. It gets worse than that. Chuck, John Calvin himself. Calvin himself is a French humanist. And so we have to be careful with these pictures. And I think, Chuck, as long as you are talking with people who are careful, you can talk to people about Iowa being corn and concrete. If the people you were talking with and you both understand that reduction, that simplification has a purpose. It has a limitation. It has a scope. It's a picture that can be abused into a stereotype. And when I speak about the Enlightenment in this extreme anti-religious secularist form, there's every danger that someone who's not very familiar with this could overly reduce, could simplify. And so Seitzma is quite right to say in that very first sentence that this particular interpretation is passé. But it comes about, what is the historian's task? Why are we studying the history? And the answer is that we study the history to help us make sense of why things are the way they are now. What does it say in the scriptures? I think it's in the Proverbs. Do not move the boundary markers of your tribe without understanding why. And I think it actually just says something to the effect of, don't move the old boundary stones. Now, some people can get all upset. There's magic in those boundary stones. And if I move the boundary stone from here to 5 feet over here, oh no, I'm disturbing the spirit of the wood. And now the evil ghost is going to come after me and my family. No, that's not what the scripture is saying at all. It's saying when you move ancient boundary markers, you are stirring the pot on difficult things that sort of lie undisturbed for the moment at the surface. There's another expression, let sleeping dogs lie. Chuck, if you have some barky bark dogs and they're taking a nap and you like the peace and you like the quiet, what do? You don't go on the porch and wake them up and think you're going to continue in that nice, peaceful setting. And so it is too in understanding history, in understanding theology. You don't stir the pot of the past and think the yip dogs of controversy aren't going to come barking at your door. And so that's what we have to do. We have to find out, where is the value? Why were the boundary markers put where they were put? Why did the people in the Enlightenment respond the way they did? Why is John Calvin so new in his French humanism? Why is Jonathan Edwards so modern? And yet, in some significant ways today, we don't see them that way. We see them as being faithful inheritors or people who've passed down successfully the best of the past. And I think that's really what so much of the Enlightenment is about. There's a break. There's a discontinuity. Chuck, if the world is too complicated for people, they will break that world down into simpler pieces that they can then understand and make sense of. I'll share this. Maybe sort of pre-2000, pre-2010, I had an interest in politics, a student of politics, like so many people. And what would I do? I would study the issues. How do we solve political problems? How do we move forward with reducing unemployment? How do we study monetary policy? How do we deal with the trade imbalance? How do we handle the balance of trade payments, given that we are now no longer on a gold standard, for example? In my mind, these were all technical challenges. These were questions to be solved by thinking about them deeply and applying these complex models of thought. And then maybe around the 2000s to the 2010s or so, society around me just went in the exact opposite direction. Instead of getting deeper into the weeds, into the nuts and the bolts, into the technical challenges of politics. Politics actually did the exact opposite. Voters started looking and saying, look at him. He's black. We've never had a black president. Yay, progress. Now, of course, that's overstated. Of course, that's reductionistic. And yet, if you have a choice to debate on this complex, deep issue of monetary policy for thousands of hours, or you can just vote for the guy who's going to promise you progress and be the first black president. Wow, what an easy choice. And Chuck, many people gravitate to the easy choice. This is why the first woman president is so tantalizing for voters today. The first alternative lifestyle, the first socialist mayor. These are reactions to the complexities of life. And instead of pushing through and studying problems in deeper and deeper ways, I have found, to my shock, Chuck, young me did not expect things to be this way. Young me thought that I would be coming into a world where the analyses would get deeper and deeper, where the politics would get more and more sophisticated. And instead, to my shock, I found it's almost the exact opposite. Politics have gotten simpler. People now no longer say, this group has a different in-depth view of fiscal policy than that group, or this group has a different view of the possible potential scientific causes behind the change in climate than this group. We just say, this group is pro-science, this group is anti-science. What do? We reduce. We make it simpler. We apply labels. What an interesting development. Like I said, I didn't see this coming. But I think that ties back to what the professor is starting to point out here. So Professor Seitzma is doing for theology what I thought would be commonplace in politics as a young man. These deep, sustained theological treatises. Nowadays, theology is just about creating categories of hurt and oppression, putting yourself in it, and voting yourself power, and voting everybody who opposes you as a racist, as a bigot. Now, that's reductionistic, of course. That's overly simplified. And yet, Chuck, it gets us so far. Is that uniquely a product of the Enlightenment? No. But you see the Enlightenment pushing back against the complex structures of medievalism. And I think that shines in what the professor has to talk about here. It's also been very instructive to me because I see the utility in it. In some sense, people need to live in a simple world where things can make sense to them. My concern is that we can create a world, a simpler world, without God. And if you look at the Enlightenment, I think that's its crowning achievement, is the rise of secularistic worldviews. Worldviews that have become, for most in Western civilization, the quote-unquote, the default narrative. What's the world like? Well, I have to find that quote real quickly from Carl Sagan. Where is it? It should be right here for me. Here we go. Sagan says this: I have a foreboding. I have a foreboding when awesome technological powers are in the hands of very few. No one representing the public interest can even grasp the issues. When the people have lost the ability to set their own agendas or knowledgeably question those in authority. Now, that's a secularist articulating, I think, a very worthwhile and interesting Enlightenment perspective. Here's the problem, Chuck. What Sagan says here sounds so appealing to me as a Christian. I'm tempted to agree with him. But what do I find? I find that when secularists like Sagan speak about ignorance, when they speak about the demon-haunted world, when they speak about backwardness, they're pointing the finger at me. I'm the racist. I'm the bigot in their world. And I say to myself, how did we get to this? How did we get to this point where I can agree with Sagan's quote and yet still end up being the bad guy in that ethos, in that mindset? And so that's my biggest concern. Chuck, that was very existential. It sort of pulls away from the Enlightenment focus of Seitzma's investigations in the chapter. Perhaps it's too macro for us to consider. But that was honestly what was going through my mind when I was reading this chapter from Seitzma. What do you think? How would you push back? And what are maybe some of the follow-on issues? This ties it. Listen, you went macro too. You pulled it in too. How then shall we live?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't it amazing how we keep coming back to those foundational questions? What do you think?
Yeah, it is really interesting, and I think I probably have to think a little bit more about some of your comments here today because I haven't I haven't thought them all through, but I think it is I think it is good and fruitful to go to those macro ideas because we do have big ideas that have had a major impact on our world. And sometimes it takes that 50,000-foot view for us to even see the contours of those ideas and how much they've affected us. It's only from pulling back much further that we can see those things. And I think that's absolutely true. There are ways that we are impacted by the cultural milieu around us, by the philosophies of our time that we don't always even see, we don't always recognize. And, perhaps if, in the new heavens and the new earth, we may, talk to somebody from, maybe a first century Christian who will look at us like, we're from Mars. Like, how could you possibly think this about that? But and to some extent, we might even get that even by going to Christians in very different contexts. A Christian who is in a persecuted house church in China, or a Christian who lives in Africa somewhere, may think about things in a very different way. I'm reading actually a book. With some friends of mine in one of my book clubs where we're discussing just that, how we have a tendency as Western Christians to look at Scripture through Western eyes, and that there is a benefit at times of also considering, how do others look at it. And one of the authors of that book was a missionary in Indonesia. And so he often brings some of his context of his work when he was in Indonesia, and how things are thought about differently. And he's talked about several Bible stories, parables of Jesus, and stories mostly from the New Testament. And he'll talk about how, as a new young missionary in Indonesia, he was often shocked by the way that people understood some of these words because they were so bound in their cultural way of thinking. And then he became to realize that it's the same for us. We're often bound in our own cultural ways of thinking. And what his theory is that we all ought to learn from each other. That he's very careful to say that there is a tendency in some areas to basically do, as you described, Brock, that we're just going to put things into black and white and good and evil, and just this one is always good, this one's always bad, and never the twain shall meet. And and he says we can't do that. We may have some weaknesses in our Western way of thinking, that we don't always realize, but that doesn't mean that there aren't those same weaknesses. An Indonesian Christian may miss some things as well because of the culture that they're within, and we're all culturally bound in our cultures, and it's always going to be difficult to see the ways in which we're culturally bound, and I think that's probably true with the ideas of the Enlightenment as well. We're much more impacted and affected by them than we think. And there's going to be, while there certainly are those radical Enlightenment thinkers who you described at the beginning, the anything but Christ, the ABC Enlightenment thinkers. There are also those Enlightenment thinkers who are more moderate. They may still hold to some of these typical ideas of the Enlightenment, but they may hold to them in different ways. Even somebody like Rene Descartes, right? Who gets discussed in this chapter as sort of an exemplar of Enlightenment thinking. Rene Descartes was a Christian. He in fact he sort of divided. He divided the world not just into a mind-body dualism, a Cartesian dualism, but he also added God as a third piece to that, as separate from mind and from body. He saw the world as and as also including that. It's just that we humans don't have access to that. Um, and where did that perhaps lead to, some of the things we've talked about, moving from Descartes maybe to Kant and beyond, to where suddenly the supernatural world is meaningless because we can't understand it, we can't sense it, and so we just ignore it. And so we do see some of that as well, but it is really interesting, and I feel like I've got to take a little bit more time to maybe think through some of the things that you've said here as well, and think about how are there ways in which we can really closely identify some things that we hold very dear. It's interesting. There are American evangelical Christians who seem to almost hold up the U.S. Constitution as to almost the same level as Scripture, and in doing that, we take on certain Enlightenment views that are very clearly a part of that. Well, and are all those things so bad? No, I as an attorney, I took an oath to protect the Constitution and to uphold it, and I don't think that was a bad oath to take. But there is also a sense where we also need to think big picture about those things, and occasionally take that 50,000-foot look downward and see some of the contours of our modern way of thinking, and recognize where, in some of those areas we may be more affected by Enlightenment thinking, by sort of modernism, than we are by what does Scripture say about these things. So it's worth thinking about. And again, as Seitzma would tell us, there's also some value to thinking about multiple enlightenments, and there are things that we can learn by thinking through things in that way. So, yeah, really interesting. Now we didn't get too far into this chapter. I think there are some things that um, maybe we can talk about further at some point. But yeah, this has been a really good discussion and really helpful for me in sort of thinking through, as I read through this chapter, what does it mean for us? Why is it important to think about these topics? And it is they are key issues, and we can see even from throughout this chapter, we get a sense of there were thinkers, theologians, philosophers, and others during this era who took real strong positions on various things, and this was their life's work, and they were really sold out to make sure that to look for the truth where that may be found, and obviously some did not find truth, but in fact found something that is very much opposed to the truth in the opposite direction as the truth. But there were Christians as well working in this world, and sort of in wrapping this up, one thing that just got me thinking a little bit in reading this chapter, but also in some of the things that you said as well, Brock. We've talked about, it's been a while since we've had this conversation, but we've talked on this program, and as we've read through Bavinck, as we do on Monday nights. We've talked about how there are some critics of Bavinck who think that he may have been too sold out even to certain modern ideas, that he was a closet modernist, or perhaps that he had moved more towards modernism during his life. And I'm not sure I buy that thesis, but I think also it's worthwhile looking at, hey, where do all of our thinkers, how were they impacted by things? Perhaps some early thinkers were much more impacted by Greek thought than we anticipated, and some more modern ones are impacted by Enlightenment or modern liberal thought than we had thought. So. Yeah, a really good discussion to have, and probably worth thinking about some more as we go forward. Before I wrap it up, Brock, any last thoughts that you have that you want to make sure that we talk about before we finish for the evening?
No, I want to say thank you, my friend. This was a beautiful way to open up this chapter. I was conflicted when reading this. What's more interesting to people watching us have the discussion of this chapter? Sort of a blow-by-blow walkthrough of the particulars of what Seitzma is outlining, which, by the way, is brilliant, is well done, is very interesting, or these jaunts that we take, you and I take, where we go from what Seitz was talking about to these macro level issues. How then shall we live? Anything but Christ. Is the Enlightenment really just French anti-religious secularism? And honestly, I wasn't sure which way to go when we started doing this. And so we went one way, and I hope it was profitable to our viewers. Maybe perhaps we'll go another way in the future. This is certainly a rich chapter. This chapter raised the bar for this Oxford Handbook of Reformed Theology, which I mentioned earlier. I'm very disappointed in some other ways, but this chapter was really a redeeming chapter, and my thanks and gratitude to Professor Seitzma for getting it included. So, Chuck, let me throw it back to you for our closing prayer.
Yeah, let's close in prayer. Our Father God, you are the God of history, God of philosophy, the God of thinkers, the God of all humans. You're a God who enjoys the creative work of your people in thinking about ideas, in applying those ideas to our lives. You are a God who revels in those things. But you're also a God who has revealed himself to us in a very particular way as well, and has directed us to understand you through the words of Scripture, through the words that you inspired and gave us to have. As we think about these topics, Lord, help us to both take joy in the creative work that's done here, to take joy in the ability that we have to learn about how our minds work and how the world works around us and how we relate to the world around us. How do we understand things? How do we know what we know? Those are all things that are good things to be thinking about and help us to find the joy in doing that, all the while recognizing that you are our creator, that all things are summed up in you, and rather than in our own philosophies, our own ways of thinking. Help us as we discuss these things to always bring honor and glory to your name and to make you central in all that we do. We pray this in the name of your precious Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.